was supposed to meet you for
the personal tutoring.
Yeah, but I had a lecture at 12 to 1, and then 12 to 1
Okay,
to 2 as well.
tomorrow, do you have time?
What time? Do you go? 11?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You still have?
No, I don't. I mean, ours is like in the morning, 9 to 10. So after that 11:30,
Okay.
I should be mine.
Okay, tomorrow. Bush House Northeast, 2.12. Okay, guys, can you hear me? Guys, can you hear me? I brought a mic. Is it on? No? Okay, so I'll try to raise my voice. Guys, we are going to start. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, we are going to start. Okay, so we are going to cover this week the historical development of capitalism. So this is the layout of the lecture. Like the emergence of the modern global economic order has been like tied with the industrial revolution or the modern Western European system or Western European order. So we need to give some sort of hints at how different parts of the world had been integrated into trade network before the emergence of the hegemonic power of the European state, in order to highlight different moments in the history of the modern economic system before the hegemonic, before the Western or before the European hegemony. And then we will try to go into some arguments which is highly contested about the origins of the modern European economic system, that actually whether or not it lied basically in changing of the demographic factors and the scope and the pattern of trade activities between the 13th and 16th century before the Industrial Revolution, or it's basically we need to highlight or to cast analytical light on the agrarian class relations and how this shift in the agrarian class relations or the peasants and landlords on the one hand, and the expropriation of the surplus value, that was the crucial factor that led to the origins or laid the groundwork of the emergence of the modern capitalist system in Europe. And then another factor tried to pivot the focus away from the endogenous factors, which is land and labor inside Europe, in order to highlight the importance of the role of colonial expansion and colonial power and slave trade and land appropriation in the Americas, and then in other countries in sub-Saharan Africa, that actually would account for the emergence or the capitalist development in Europe. And then the modern political economy, that actually as a research program, they highlight different issues. They shifted the focus from the origins of the modern European economic order towards why others lagged behind. How can we extend our model, or our economic model of development or of progress to other countries that lagged behind. Basically, the modernization that emerged, the debate the debate actually emerged in the 1950s and 1960s, and then the critics that they developed alternative theoretical frameworks like dependency, the world system theory, and the research program of political economy that highlighted state-society relations, state capacity, the role of geopolitics and institutions. And here we are going to focus our seminar discussions about, like, how the modern, capitalist system function in the global south. Basically, we're going to cover the hierarchical modern the hierarchical economic order in Latin America, and then whether or not some states that managed to develop in the global south offered alternative capitalist model to the Washington Consensus. Basically, we are going to investigate further the case of China, whether or not it offered, like, Beijing Consensus as an alternative to Washington Consensus, and then the role of institutions. To what extent, this kind of how, like the conflict of interest between different political powers shape actually the economic institutions, and we are going to investigate in some detail the case of Kenya, how this dialectical relationship between economic interest and political power shape some sort of inefficient economic institutions. Okay, so do you have any idea how the world or the economic transactions operated before or during the 13th century and before the 13th century, how it actually functioned elsewhere outside of Europe? So what would make any economic order modern, and what would make any economic or other economic order as, like, traditional? Yeah?
I guess before 13th century probably was like agrarian economics, and after that, technically it's modernization. Coming out of agrarian economy is probably what is modernization is.
Okay, so what's modern economic order or economic system? Yeah, Jude?
I think I remember briefly talking about how before it was based on theology and how everything was a top-down approach from those that could read, whereas modern would be a break away from a more secular approach, rather than having everything based from, like, religious men who would tell everyone what something would be. It would be access to technology and tools that are away from that kind of dogmatic approach.
Okay. Yeah, so if I ask, like, the organization of any production, when you can dub it as a modern organizational structure or like traditional one, yeah?
Probably moving away from a feudal system to something more market-oriented.
Yeah, so it's basically, they try to make this differentiation between what's traditional and what's new based on this differentiated, like, division of labor and the organization of production. Whether or not there is a separation between like the ownership of capital and the ownership of the labor power. So they call it modern economic order when there is kind of free wage labor that actually draw the line between the feudalistic or the feudal system and the modern capitalist order or the modern capitalist development in Europe. So actually there is, like, a tendency to link, this modernity or the modern capitalist system with the degree of urbanization and the degree of industrialization or the expansion of the trade system. But this is basically very Eurocentric understanding of the emergence of the modern or any kind of global economic order, because before the emergence of the modern economic order or before the Industrial Revolution, there had been some sort of transactions and trade exchanges between different parts of the world, stretching from northwestern Europe to China and India, and actually there were some sort of techniques of pooling capital and distributing risks in China, India, and some areas in some cities in the Middle East. So, like in China, for example, like in the 12th and 13th century, they managed to develop some sort of they made some sort of progress in printing technology and paper making, and it took centuries for Europe in order to catch up with this technology. In the East, in India and some Middle Eastern countries as well, they had they got engaged in this kind of trade partnership in order to stimulate trade transactions and to distribute risks by having partnership with other merchants that would advance the good, and or financiers that would pay in advance, some sort of money in order to get the goods and then to ship them to their destination. So they need to appropriate, some sort of benefits between the merchants and the partner that would actually take the goods to its own destination, or to protect it, because there is a risk that it wouldn't reach its destination in long distance trade. So that's why they need to develop some sort of techniques of exchange in order to make these transactions in the first place, and in order to distribute risk, in order to offer incentives for partners and merchants to get engaged in trade transactions. That happened in China, India, and some areas in the Middle East, and they had some sort of printing or minting coins. They used good in order to make these kind of transactions. What actually Abu Lughd mentioned, in order to refute, this Eurocentric notion of modern or basically European economic order, she tried to mention that there had been some sort of integrated system of trade transactions between different parts of the world, and Europe didn't take the lead in these kind of transactions. China, India, and some cultural centers or commercial centers in the Middle East, they were involved in this process. So what she tried to mention here, it was not kind of historical necessity of the development of Europe. It has something to do with how actually other factors, exogenous factors, intervened that actually affected the underdevelopment record of the East. So any historical information about exogenous factors that affected, the East, how the East actually lagged behind after, a long period of taking some sort of advance in trade networks or trade transactions? So it has something to do with the changing trade routes as well. So Portuguese, they gained some sort of control over trade routes in the Red Sea, and that actually had some connection in the ocean and to the India. So that's why it lost, some sort of its advantage. India lost, and some Middle Eastern countries lost their advantage when it comes to controlling trade routes. Merchants' powers as well in the East, because in China, for example, and some Middle Eastern entities or territories, the state actually gathered or followed this heavy-handed strategy. So it borrowed, some money from the merchants without any obligation to make any kind of repayment for them, and they obliged the states, in China and some parts in the Middle East. It actually forced merchants to make some contribution to the public coffers without necessarily having any kind of any benefits in return. So the merchants, the merchants in Europe, they gained some sort of leverage, and in order to negotiate their own power and to gain some sort of benefits in terms of protection and to expand their own trades, not necessarily in primary goods, but in other goods that help them to accumulate wealth. And exogenous factors as well, it has something to do with plagues, like in the Black Death, for example, that actually spread from China to different countries, different European countries. But China, it was hit hard by the disease rather than other European countries, that it changed the demographic balance inside China, and it took several decades in order to recover from this demographic imbalances. So what's important here, it's not there were some sort of crucial moments of the modern economic order before the European hegemony, but there were some sort, or there had been some sort of trade networks, some sort of economic transactions in the East that occurred, but it didn't like lead to any kind of advancement of the East. And in order to investigate why Europe developed, you need to investigate, you need to dig deeper into different other causes rather than highlighting why it developed and others lagged behind, or why it pulled ahead after it had, it was like some sort of economic lagger. We don't have like any sort of hard or comparable data in order to make these kind of rigorous, research design in order to highlight this is the only or the important factor that would that actually led to the development of Europe in relation or in comparison to other countries in the East. But like this is like how to push or to shift the focus away from endogenous factors that led to the European, the development, the capitalist development in Europe, and focus on other factors or other dynamics that paved the way, for this to happen. So do you think, like, from your, try to give it a guess, like, if we focus on demographic and trade or commercialization factors, how, like, demographic factors or trade networks or trade transactions would enable any country to be economically advanced or to make some sort of headway when it comes to economic development? Anyone here has like economic background? How many people do you have like economic background? No? Okay. Okay, so the like basic, like very kind of logical way of thinking. If like some cities like engaged in commercial and building commercial networks or have some sort of intensive or extensive trade transactions between them, what would make them like wealthy cities, or what would enable merchants that engaged in these transactions to accumulate wealth? Yeah?
Free market, like an understandable free market between nations.
Yeah? So they call it like these kind of demographic and trade factors would leave it all to the market mechanisms like supply and demand factors in order to determine, the accumulation logic or the accumulation of benefits. So for example, like, if they have like, this kind of natural inclination to get engaged in these economic transactions, so people will circulate wealth and will accumulate benefits out of this. So the logic of competition here, if you engage in this trade, so you need to reduce the cost of production in order to prevail in the price competition. You need to sell your goods in cheaper prices in order to prevail in the competition with other merchants, right? So these cities, tried to, there was kind of competition between these cities. Merchants in these cities, they formed some sort of commercial units or commercial centers in order to extend the networks of the trade exchanges, and the accumulated wealth that actually helped later these cities or European commercial centers to accumulate wealth and to lay the groundwork for the modern capitalist development in Europe. Any critique to this argument? And demographic factors as well, like, the increasing, population or decreasing population rate would affect, the supply and demand for the producers. Basically, back then, mainly the peasants that they had to work, to cultivate lands. Any critique to this? Actually, there is no historical evidence that would support this argument. For example, Florence they have like, merchants there, they formed their autonomous commercial units, and they built some sort of infrastructure, like extensive infrastructure, in order to facilitate trade between different cities, and they gained some sort of autonomy and in like negotiating and bargaining power in relation to political rulers, but it had nothing to do with the future, capitalist development. Arguably, England, that had like highly centralized political authority back then, it made some sort of capitalist development or capitalist advancement in comparison to Europe. And I'm not sure if you know what's the integral part of any capitalist system. What's the crucial element of the capitalism? To what? Yeah, competition. But to do what? For the sake of what?
Money. I don't know.
Yeah, accumulation?
Yeah.
Yeah, how they would actually reach this, how they would accumulate capital.
I don't have
So can you speak up? Yeah, yeah,
Surplus and not so much deficit.
yeah. So basically, they need to create added value, and they appropriate, this surplus. They extract, this kind of surplus value. So the transformation of production in order to create this and to accumulate capital and keep the wheel running, it's a very integral part, and it's very essential for any capitalist system to function. So the point here, trade didn't allow this to happen. It was like kind of circulation of wealth rather than transformation of production, or changing, the relationship between different forces of production, or the relationship of production. So that's why, in order to understand the emergence of the capitalism or the development of the capitalism, you need to analyze the property rights and the social property relation. So basically, they call it the relationship between the direct producers and land, okay, and then the relationship between peasants and landlords, in order to understand how the surplus, was extracted and appropriated by the landlords. So the point here, we are still investigating the trade and commercialization and demographic factors, but you need to put them in a perspective. You need to see how changing these social relations and class relations and intensity of class struggles, they actually affected the magnitude and the degree by which these factors changed, the patterns of income distribution and paved the way for economic growth in Europe. Okay. So starting with the demographic changes and class structure, we put this in interactive relationship with the class structure and the class relation. So in the 13th century, what happened? It was like, a decreasing high level of, high rate of population growth that actually led to land occupation and decreasing or land degradation because of these kind of settlements and land occupation from the part of the population. This led to the diminishing return of agriculture. So what happened if you have high rate of population growth when it comes to the supply and demand forces? So if you have large supply of labor, so this would actually give some sort of leverage for landlords over the labor in order to extract any surplus, and they didn't have any negotiating power in relation to the landlord. So they had to accept any terms of declining wages in order to get access or to retain their hold on land. And the landlords, they had some sort of coercive extractive power through harsh taxation system in order to enforce them to pay money and to appropriate these kind of surplus. It was the opposite way around in the 14th and 15th century. The decreasing population growth, it actually increased demands for labor or for producers to work or to cultivate lands. So with the increasing demands for peasants or for producers, this would actually increase their leeway or their bargaining power in relation to the landlords, and they had, they managed to gain some sort of free mobility. So the landlords in some areas, they lost their ability to control or to restrict, the mobility of the producers, and some of them, they managed to gain some sort of titles like freeholders titles. They farm their own lands and they gain their own titles. So this is changing of the relationship, the class relationship between the producers and the landlords. It affected the extractive power of the landlords in relation to their the producers or the peasants. So that's why, in this sense, the intensity of the class struggle between the landlords and producers, it affected the continuity or the breakdown of the old system. So with this, like, when they offer, some sort of free mobility of the labor, it didn't mark actually an end of slavery. So still, the landlords had some sort of power over peasants or over producers, and it was not like free exchange, like labor in exchange for free wages. They didn't sell their labor for free wages. Still, the landlords, they had the power in order to force them to cultivate lands and to extract some surpluses. The argument here that the intensity of the class struggle, it affected in a way or another the development of capitalist agriculture in some places in Europe rather than in others. So the two contrasting cases were England versus France. Do you have any idea what happened? So under what conditions, these kind of a changing class relationship would affect commercialization and the emergence of capitalist agriculture in England, for example, and it didn't pave the way to do that in France. Okay, England didn't allow for any kind of ownership of the direct producer. It was like, completely created completely class of propertyless direct producers or peasants. They allowed only, to large capitalists in order to own the lands and to make, these large-scale agricultural operations. So they managed to lease out, these kind of lands to large capitalists, and they avoided any kind of fragmentation of the lands. So the only way for producers or peasants to get access to land is to improve their productivity in order to get access to the lands, because the incentives of the landowners here just to increase the productivity and improve their productivity in order to compete, with other producers by decreasing, the cost of production. Decreasing the cost of production, it has something to do with the productivity of the producers, the peasants. So they had to invest in a way or another to improve, their productivity, and the only way for them to get access to is to improve themselves in order to get access to land. So they created a class of propertyless people, like propertyless peasants. So they left the agriculture outside of the agricultural sector. So they had, to leave these areas, and they had to find a job. So it's part of, they worked as, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the concept, but here, by creating this class outside of the agricultural sector, so they created, some sort of potential workers, potential wage workers to get engaged in industrial, like industrialization or industrial sectors when they migrated, to urban areas. So they created, some sort of workforce to get incorporated or integrated into the industrial sector away from the agricultural sector. And they created some sort of integrated national market by allowing this class or propertyless class to buy some sort of cheap consumer goods. So they created some sort of integrated national market, and it was part of creating a workforce to get incorporated into the industrial sector later on. In France, it was like totally the opposite way around. So they allowed farmers to, they farmed out lands to like small farmers on terminable contractual leases. So it led to the fragmentation of the lands. So they didn't allow for any kind of concentration of the capital or capitalization of the agriculture. And like the argument here, it was not like, you know, they were not completely dispossessed like class, like the peasants there, they had, you know, they owned, you know, some sort of, pieces of lands, and they were not completely dispossessed, which was essential to according to this argument, that was essential for the development of the capitalism. And what happened, like when the state or the centralized authority tried to reappropriate land, it created intensive class struggle between the landowners and the peasants, that they didn't want to leave their lands, or they actually resisted, you know, this reappropriation of lands. So that was like, you know, the argument about how the class relation or the intensity of the class struggle affected, you know, the commercialization of the agriculture and the emergence of capitalism, or laid the groundwork for the emergence of capitalism in England in comparison to France. Okay, any take on this argument? Any critique of this argument, the social relation one? So those who focused on supply and demand forces when it comes to the demographic and trade factors, it was like refuted. This argument was refuted by the social forces or the class struggle. And then the class struggle here. So can you offer any critique to this? Yeah, other arguments, they focus on, like, in order to investigate the capitalist development in Europe, you don't need to focus only on endogenous factors like land and labor and the relationship between the forces of production and the relationship of production. You need to highlight as well some exogenous factors, which is integral part of the capitalist development in Europe. And that actually happened by some writings that focus on the role of the colonial policies that actually fed back or contributed to the development of capitalism in Europe. So how colonial policies affected capitalist development in Europe, or contributed to the capitalist development in Europe? What did European forces do in former colonies?
Didn't it start with the East India Company, like a capitalist, like expansion? That's an example of how, like, an enterprise started off with trade and then moved on to colonize.
Yeah. So basically, like, because the argument of social relations, it's part, they call it, I'm avoiding, you know, these kind of technical terminologies, but part of this is commodification of labor, okay? Like, you know, the free to sell only the appropriation of the surplus value had only to happen through economic means. Like, you know, people, like labor would send their labor in exchange for some money in return. But actually it didn't happen. Like in the 16th century, European powers, they got engaged in slave trade, and they appropriated lands, you know, from the indigenous people in the Americas, and it helped them to accumulate capital, and neither land nor labor was actually a commodity. They actually, Fraser, for example, they divided, you know, the historical development of capitalism into 4 phases. The commercial capitalism that happened between the 16th and 18th century, and then 19th century, like the colonial capitalism, and then the social democratic phase and the emergence of the welfare state, and then the last phase, it came with the globalization and financialization of the economic system. So during this period, so what happened, like the European companies, actually they were granted authority in the name of the monarchs and the Pope, and they had like the authority to explore and accumulate benefits by purging, lands of indigenous population in the Americas. And basically it was like Portugal and Spain, and then followed by France, England, and the Dutch. And then they accumulated wealth through enslaving, like coercive labor and slave trade in order to force them to work in agricultural or mining sectors. So the way to accumulate wealth, it happened through expropriation or land appropriation and enslavement of indigenous population in former colonies. It happened first in the Americas. And then what they call like state-managed colonialism, it happened in the 19th century when like these colonial powers or European colonial powers, they transformed, these or domesticated actually the activities of these companies like Virginia and East India Company, for example, or the English India Company. They domesticated these activities and transformed these activities into colonial project through establishing direct colonial rule in sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa and in the middle, some parts in the Middle East. So the colonial authority, they had the power to impose taxes and to capitalize lands. Like they did, this capitalization through imposing taxes and through creating this system of mortgage finance and monopolizing international trade. So they forced, landowners or landlords or the class of domestic landlords to produce, for example, some sort of cash crops that actually helped their industries to function and to flourish in Europe. So that was like, they managed, through these kind of capitalization and financialization and imposing taxation system on in former colonies to accumulate wealth that helped them to progress and to develop. And then they mentioned something related to the emergence of the social democratic capitalism. When did like social democrats emerge or gain some sort of powerful position in Europe? Okay, when did the welfare state emerge?
I think it was just the Second World War.
Yeah?
Well, actually earlier. The Liberals
Yeah.
did it after the First World War.
But when it comes to the redistribution of wealth, the discourse of redistribution of wealth and like the transaction or the bargaining power or the bargaining framework between labor and capitalist, when did it happen? Okay, so according to this argument, you can offer, some sort of criticism after, like, I present the argument thoroughly here. So the argument here, European countries, they got engaged in these kind of redistributive policies after the Second World War, but it came at the expense of former colonies as well. So they redistributed money, or they renegotiated, minimum wages and these kind of material benefits to their own citizens, but it came at the expense of former colonies, for example. For example, what happened in India, they had, their currency reserves in sterling securities. So through currency manipulation by devaluation, for example, so the India lost like, I think like one half or 1/3 of the value of its currency, but it relieved, some significant proportion of the debt repayment for the English authority. So instead of making any kind of repayment of the debt to former colonies, through these kind of manipulative economic policies, they managed to get around and to backtrack on their debt repayment in order to to make these kind of appropriation in order to distribute or to offer some sort of social goods provision to their own citizens. But it came as well at the expense, of the former colonies, some sort of compensation or debt repayment for former colonies. And then, and this is what we are going to focus on, this financialized capitalism, how it offered some sort of new forms of colonialism by allowing multinational corporations, to come in and to establish their own business, and it has allowing for these MNCs, to function within national territories. It has something to do with the overall performance of capitalism. As we are going to see, it has something to do with the corporate governance and investment in labor skills, because actually they came to establish their own businesses without any obligation to transfer any technology or to establish any sort of training programs for domestic laborers to acquire new skills and to get engaged in the new division of labor in the world economy. Okay? Any critique to these arguments? You agree? Okay, of course, the argument that focuses on the social relation is purely Marxist. Okay, it's the main definition of capitalism from Marxist perspective, and this one is from post-colonial or decolonial perspective as well. So can you think of any missing dimension here or missing elements? We will get back to this when we discuss Kenya, Robert Bates' chapter in the seminar, okay, about this kind of class relations and colonial, the legacy of the colonial policies, and how they affected the emergence or the efficiency of economic institutions. Okay, so try to when you read the chapter, try to think about these analytical frameworks and try to be critical of both of them. Okay, so the analytical focus has been shifted in the 20th century, in the mid 20th century, to pose a totally different question. It's not about debate about the origins of as European, our modern capitalist system or capitalist development, but why others actually lagged behind and how they would catch up with our economic progress, or how we should extend our economic model, modern economic model, to these countries. So do you have any idea what proponents of modernization theory mention or argue? Okay, so they mentioned that why these countries or developing countries lagged behind because of the lack of these modern values and cultural patterns. They actually hold on to these kind of traditional values, that paternalistic and scriptive and somehow religious, that actually precluded them from achieving economic progress. So that's why they made the distinction between modern societies and traditional societies. And of course, they came for criticism because of this Eurocentric or ethnocentric understanding of economic development. So the political economy approaches try to revive or recover the historical material side of Max Weber. We need to understand the development, the historical development of capitalism in these countries, in the developing countries right now. We forgot, we put aside the European development, when we need to understand the underdevelopment of non-European countries, okay? So here we need to understand the role of the state, the distribution of power between different social groups, and we need to investigate further, the development of institutions there and the role of the Marxist idea, the role of different, like the dynamics of the conflict between different social forces and how this affected economic progress or the lack of economic progress. So in order to understand fully or to offer satisfactory account of their underdevelopment, you need to highlight other factors. You need to relegate, these kind of cultural patterns and values to a marginal spot, and you need to refocus the analysis to these institutional and social or social struggle or social class elements in order to understand this. And in these traditions, dependency theory actually emerged in order to understand the lack of or the economic underdevelopment. Basically, it emerged first in Latin America. So you need to understand, to highlight the interest of different social classes and the alliance between these domestic classes or local classes and other foreign capitalist and foreign classes as well. So you need to understand the complexity of the class alliances and the complexity of the class conflict in these countries. Rather than highlighting cultural patterns and values, you need to investigate their interest, and you need to investigate the overall political and social structure as well. World systems theory, anyone heard of this? Yeah? Go ahead. Yeah? Yeah?
Yeah, I think like not everybody works the same. It kind of throws out what every model and the roster models of the development.
Yeah. So the whole point here is the positionality of these states in the world or the global economic system. So they divided this into core and periphery. So the countries, individual countries might develop, but the overall pattern of development, it's a function of these kind of geographical division between the core and the periphery. Okay, so that's why Europe in the 16th century, actually, with their extensive trade networks, they became, the core, and other countries, they became the periphery. So they depended on the export of these primary goods to Europe in order to build their extensive industrial basis, for example. So that's like the position of the states in this global, the structure of the world system is essential in order to understand the development or underdevelopment of the periphery or non-European countries. So we have like the political economy approaches, the focus, like they brought, these Weberian materialistic side and Marxist class relation element, into the analysis in order to understand the underdevelopment in the global south. So you have like one stream in the literature, they focus on state-society relation. So you need to understand these patterns of class relations and transnational alliances. For example, in Egypt, like landowners, they had some sort of alliance with British industrialists that actually prevented any imposition of domestic tariffs in order that actually helped more the British textile industries to flourish rather than accumulating some sort of benefits and wealth, domestic national wealth, in order to use or to channel, this kind of surplus into like public goods or education or healthcare programs. So you need to understand these kind of class alliance and the complexity between different interests and how they get together, how they form alliance, and to what extent these alliances would feed back into the development process, the economic, the formulation of economic policies. State capacity as well, like if you need to understand economic development or underdevelopment in the global south, you need to understand the state or the role of the state as an active actor in and of itself. So you need to, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, rent-seeking activities and incompetent bureaucratic apparatuses would help us understand, this kind of underdevelopment in these nations. Or you need to offer more complex understanding by bringing, as the state-society relation offer this kind of complexity between the domestic and the international alliances. Here the geopolitical account proponents would say, you know what, you need to understand the interaction between domestic and international factors. For example, the development of developmental state in South Korea and Taiwan, it has something to do with the United States, the aid that came from the United States, and it was like geopolitical motivation behind that. It was not only economic factors. United States wanted to fight against the spread of communism, so that's why it did channel some sort of funds and aids to these states that helped them to make some sort of advance economically. And then institutions as an outcome of some sort of conflicting interest between different social forces. So in order to understand the emergence, the evolution, or the continuity of certain economic institutions, efficient or inefficient, you need to highlight the distribution of power or the conflict between different social forces in society. And this is what we are going to focus on in the case of Kenya, for example, in the seminar. Okay, so in the seminar we are going to understand how to offer a critique, to the Marxist, in a way, to a Marxist and these kind of colonial perspective accounts of the development of capitalism. And we need to understand which of these analytical frameworks would help us understand the lack of development in some countries, and whether or not China or other country would offer like an alternative to the neoliberal Western model of capitalism. Okay? So we have like the hierarchical market economy in Latin America by Schneider. We have Robert Bates in Kenya, and we have I think Scott Kennedy on Beijing Consensus. Okay, we will follow the same format. Like you'll be divided into 3 groups, and then you try to be critical of the material. Okay, they are not technical. Yeah, you should have read them. Any question? Okay, so in the seminar, we're going to apply these analytical frameworks to the cases. Okay? Yeah.
Still can't hear you. I'm exhausted from trying so hard to listen.
I brought the mic. I'm not sure it didn't work.
It's weird because you move this way and sometimes it will pick up. And the second you move this way, I can't hear anything.
It didn't work? Okay. I brought the mic.
You have a quiet speaking voice anyway, so the microphone I don't think is working. So, like, you have a very quiet speaking voice. And the microphone, I don't know, like I just couldn't hear you. I'm sorry, if I wanted to let you know.
You have the lecture recorded?
I don't think you'll be able to hear it.
For the recorded one?
Yeah. Like genuinely.
Yeah. Okay, can we talk like outside because there is like another class? Yeah. Okay, I'll wait outside, okay?
Yeah.
How are you? Good to see you.